again, just to make sure we weren't singing here quietly. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad you were able to join us for this webinar. I'm always kind of disappointed because we don't get to actually speak in person before we get started, but it's lovely to meet you, and thank you so much for joining us. So welcome everybody. My name is Emily Langen, and I'm the program officer here at Clare Boothe Luce, and we're so happy to have you join us this afternoon with our guest speaker, Samantha Schroeder. Here at the Center for Conservative Women, our mission is to prepare women for effective leadership and to promote leading conservative women. Our materials, programs, and initiatives all support ideas and efforts that are pro-America, pro-family, support free enterprise and entrepreneurship, and we encourage our supporters and students to be active ambassadors of conservative philosophy at their schools, at their workplaces, and within their communities. If you're interested in learning more about the Center for Conservative Women, I invite you to visit our website, cblwomen.org, or send us an email for more info at info@cblwomen.org. All right, so let's jump into the webinar. Introducing Samantha today is one of our summer fellows, Audrey Weikin. A current student at the University of Florida, Audrey is majoring in political science with a minor in business administration and economics, and hopes to someday serve as a member of Congress. We're grateful to have you here with us, Audrey.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
And so Samantha is currently the Deputy Director of FedSoc Films, where she leads the digital team, working as a video producer, project manager, and content creator. Samantha previously worked as Director of External Affairs at the Foreign Policy Initiative and Program Manager at the Alexander Hamilton Society. She also serves as a consultant for various nonprofits, including the Future Symphony Institute and the Hildebrand Legacy Project, serves on the board of the Thomas More Society, and volunteers as a committee member for the Thomistic Institute on the Hill. Samantha graduated from the University of Central Florida in 2012 with a degree in philosophy. She writes extensively about faith, culture, and issues impacting today's women for various publications, including Uncultured, The Federalist, and Public Discourse. I'm so excited to hear from and learn from Samantha today. Throughout her talk, please feel free to submit questions for our question and answer session at the end. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I noticed there's some gentlemen on the call. My name is Samantha Schroeder. It's nice to be here with you all, and I'm just going to open with my talk. So in 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams, quote, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such limited power into the hands of the husbands. We will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. I'm going to share an excerpt with you from our forthcoming video from FedSoc Films, Remember the Ladies, featuring Heather Higgins, CEO of Independent Women's Voice and chairman of its sister organization, Independent Women's Forum. The video, pull quote, goes like this. In 1848, a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, launched the suffrage movement. These women sought equality with men, including the right to vote, taking the Declaration of Independence as their model. The Susan B. Anthony Amendment was proposed at a special session of the 66th Congress, convened shortly after the end of World War I. More than 70 years after the women's suffrage movement began, on August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution. While many of the opponents to this movement were men, a lot of the push against women's suffrage came from other women. Some feared the social change that suffrage would bring to the family. Others worried that women's status as the privileged sex, operating in the non-political spheres of motherhood, education, philanthropy, civil service, and societal reform, would be compromised. Still, others thought it would undermine traditional gender roles, which would create an increase in divorce rates and force women into the labor market. They worried that political responsibilities would overburden women who were already very busy. And they worried about an influx of uninformed voters making decisions on important political matters. Now switching to my content. In summary, this push for women's suffrage is an example of what contemporary feminists would call equity feminism, with equity meaning equal legal and civil rights for women as for men. This idea of equity was a goal of the first wave feminist movement, a kind of libertarian or classically liberal ideal of equality between the sexes, which has, through a gradual change in law and policy, become realized over the last 150 years. Yet, as the anti-suffragists point out, the cost of social change can be high. As predicted, the aftershocks of a century of various women's movements have impacted the family, traditional gender roles, marriage, and divorce in the labor market. Feminism as a political ideology presents a thesis of the relationship between women and men, and in particular, women and patriarchal civilization. Between women and men, as well as between women and civilization, is an essential tension between the desire for freedom and equality, most notably, and perhaps most controversially, sexual freedom, and the demand for repression of that freedom that feminism attributes to the patriarchy. The aims of feminism can generally be divided into two categories: equality of access to important sectors of society that should not be gender restrictive, for example, access to higher education and the professional world, and access to positive rights that have been historically denied to women, for example, the right to control reproduction and access contraception. Because feminism as a political ideology seeks increasing political freedoms that evolve as identity politics evolve, and even more positive rights are created, feminism has become a threat to limited government and seeks to challenge, alter, and even destroy the most basic formations of society, in particular, the marital relationship between man and woman and the begetting of children within that relationship. Men have slowly, if not already, to feminists become irrelevant. The suffrage movement was inevitable. As society evolved and progressed, it was only a matter of time before societies reached a level of civilization that would make space for women beyond the domestic sphere of influence. But this equity feminism is not what the third wave or contemporary feminism is all about. The theme of feminism today is gender feminism, which profoundly affects women, especially in the workplace. What did women actually do beyond housework that could possibly justify their voice in the political sphere? As I was researching for our 19th Amendment video, I came upon a very interesting document titled Careers for Women, compiled and edited by Catherine Filene from 1920. The document is, quote, a complete and authoritative guide to 160 occupations open to women, to every girl who has felt that her choice of career is limited to nursing, teaching, and stenography. For those of you who might not know, stenography is a typist. These articles will come as a revelation, enabling her to choose from among 160 possible vocations, just the career that will bring her success and happiness. And among these listed occupations in this document, we have the style expert, the opera singer, the tea room manager, the beekeeper, the professional storyteller, the playwright, the architect, the photographer, the professional shopper, the motion picture director, the reporter, the pharmacist, the woman surgeon, the woman dentist, politics, and my personal favorite, the detective. Thank you, Nancy Drew, for breaking that glass ceiling. Perhaps the 1920s aren't as archaic or oppressive as they may seem in our modern memory. Though many of these careers sound tailor-made for women, a good number of them are gender-neutral careers. Feminist movements in America began with a valid complaint of inequality, to open education to the female sex, and continued to open doors to the professional life for women throughout the 20th century. In the latter half of the 20th century, with the advent of the sexual revolution and increased access to technologies of contraception, feminism took a sharp Freudian turn to expand equality with men to the sexual sphere, leading to the breakdown of the relationships between men and women, and a radical redefinition of courtship rituals and the reinvention of the family. The title of this talk, Feminism and its Discontents, is referencing a famous book by Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. And this book, first published in 1930 as Das Überhagen in der Kultur, I'm a terrible German speaker, half German myself, the Uneasiness of Civilization. The book he published, Civilization and Its Discontents, examines what Freud identifies as a clash between the desire for individuality and the expectations of society. Civilization and Its Discontents is one of the most influential works in psychology, and I think this clash in his work between the desire for individuality and freedom found in both equity and gender feminism is the historic and present expectation, and the historic and present expectations of society encapsulates the tension and desire in the feminist movement itself. The origin story of feminism is a story of class struggle. Only the class in this struggle is gender, namely the female sex. According to the feminist mythos, women are born into patriarchal societies that are inherently oppressive of women, from their access to equal education, which historically is true, to the ability of women to pursue professions in society equal to men, again, historically true, to the moral oppression of a society that imposes virtue on women and seeks to free women from the biblical or moralistic shackles of, say, virginity and chastity, to be able to seek sex like men, as you might have seen if you ever watched Sex and the City. After suffrage, the first great political movement of equity achieved by women and for women, the new goal of feminism, perhaps the primary, ultimate, or only goal of both equity and gender feminism, is in the sphere of rights, namely reproductive rights. Today's feminists are obsessed with technologies of reproduction, contraception, abortion, and all the laws surrounding them. Per their own political priorities, if you are a woman who supports women and their fertility, opposing abortion, contraception, and the laws and public policies that gradually chisel away at the structure of the family and traditional gender roles and relationships between the sexes, you are not a feminist. Sexism will always exist. The way to combat sexism in the workplace is not through feminism, but through speaking out and defending yourself as a lady. Male bashing, toxic femininity, or dwelling in your female victimhood are not viable solutions to the very fair criticism of feminists, to the persistent problems of inequity and sexism, or even misogyny in the workplace or public square. Educating yourself as a woman or as a man surrounded by women and preparing to defend yourself when conflict arises is the proper response to the anti-intellectual response to sexism and misogyny, which is often the feminist response to such attacks on their access to education and work. While we can't completely eradicate the negative isms like sexism or racism from every interaction in every corner of the world, we can prepare to respond to them. So my favorite feminist, Camille Paglia, whom I affectionately refer to as my liberal lesbian spirit animal, and again, who refers to herself as an anti-feminist feminist, wrote a phenomenal book that I only just began to finally read this year, Sexual Personae. Art and Decadence from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson, originally published in 1990, the year I was born. In the first chapter, Sex and Violence, or Nature and Art, Paglia writes, quote, "Sexuality and eroticism are the intricate intersection of nature and culture. Feminists grossly oversimplify the problem of sex when they reduce it to a matter of social convention. Readjust society, eliminate sexual inequality, purify sex roles, and happiness and harmony will reign." Here, feminism, like all liberal movements of the past 200 years, is heir to Rousseau. The Social Contract, 1762, begins, quote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Rousseauism was reborn in the post-war generation of the 60s, from which contemporary feminism developed, end quote. This idea of Rousseau's echoes the idea in The Second Sex by very famous feminist French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir, who was very in vogue when I was studying philosophy in college between 2008 and 2012, whose thesis was that, quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." For feminists, the feminine gender is a societal chain, and the feminist movement is the political ideology designed to free women from woman. The problem with feminism today is in its infinite mutations. In the nonprofit world, we call this mission creep, when a project or mission of an organization evolves beyond its original scope, focus, or goals, often inspired by a project or a mission's initial successes, in this case, suffrage. As Paglia continues in the inaugural chapter of her first book, feminism, quote, "sees every hierarchy as repressive, a social fiction. Every negative about woman is a male lie designed to keep her in her place. Feminism has exceeded its proper mission of seeking political equality for women and has ended by rejecting contingency, that is, human limitation by nature or fate," end quote. These words were published 30 years ago this year. They are still true today. This is why I'm not a feminist. I'm in fact an anti-feminist. Perhaps you have heard the term toxic femininity pop up in debates here and there online. What is toxic femininity? There are differing views on what it is and whether it even exists. In a Psychology Today article I found on the topic, the author presents this definition: Quote, women expressing stereotypically feminine traits such as passivity, empathy, sensuality, patience, tenderness, and receptivity, which result in women ignoring their mental or physical needs to sustain those around them. How can, I ask, such feminine traits like empathy, patience, and tenderness be a toxic attribute of the female sex? Gender feminism will tell you that there are no feminine traits, only human ones. Of course, men can express empathy, patience, and tenderness. But in the workplace, a social sphere historically operated by and for men, such feminine values might be seen as weakness and therefore never manifest among coworkers. Perhaps this is why Blessed Fulton Sheen, the great televangelist, my favorite Catholic ever, once asked in an episode of his 1950s era primetime show, does professional life harden a woman? He goes on to answer this question of the hardened female in the workforce. Quote, there is nothing in professional life to harden any women. A woman becomes hard only when she loses an opportunity to manifest those specifically feminine qualities of sympathy and kindness and tenderness. Every woman in the world was made to be a mother, either spiritually or physically. A woman in a professional life is happy when she has an occasion to be feminine. Toxic femininity, what you often see in modern feminist manifestos, is not the element of the feminine that undermines women, but its opposite. Toxic femininity in the workplace is women becoming hardened in their professional lives, women lacking empathy, patience, tenderness, and receptivity to the needs of others. If women encounter in their fellow workplace women who have been hardened by professional life, it is best to respond to them with empathy and patience. And that is not toxic, it's femininity. I am not a feminist, I am a feminine lady. As philosopher Alice von Hildebrand wrote in an interview on her 2002 book, The Privilege of Being a Woman, also a work I highly recommend, quote, the amazing thing is that feminism, instead of making women more profoundly aware of the beauty and dignity of their role as wives and mothers, and of the spiritual power that they can exercise over their husbands, convinced them that they too had to adopt a secularist mentality. They too should enter the workforce. They too should prove themselves that they were someone by getting diplomas, competing with men in the work market, showing that they were their equals, and when given opportunities, could outsmart them. They let themselves become convinced that femininity meant weakness. They started to look down upon virtues such as patience, selflessness, self-giving, tenderness, and aimed at becoming like men in all things. Some of them even convinced themselves that they had to use coarse language in order to show the strong sex that they were not fragile, delicate, insignificant dolls that the men had believed them to be. End quote. It is Alice von Hildebrand who perhaps defines toxic femininity best here, equating femininity with weakness and looking down upon the traditionally feminine virtues, trading them instead for unfeminine vices like coarse language and the hardness of personality that Fulton Sheen speaks of. Instead of trading whatever feminine virtues we exhibit for their equivalent vices, women should instead seek to cultivate the virtues that make her a better woman to lead others, especially men, to virtue and to greatness in the workplace. The civilizing effect that women have on men is highlighted by perhaps my favorite Fulton Sheen quote of all time. Quote, to a great extent, the level of any civilization is the level of its womanhood. When a man loves a woman, he has to become worthy of her. The higher her virtue, the more noble her character, the more devoted she is to truth, justice, goodness, the more a man has to aspire to be worthy of her. End quote. If a generation of ladies led the way, a generation of gentlemen will follow. Feminism, an ideology with significant political implications, has unfortunately come to dominate discourse among women in America today. It is almost assumed that if you are a woman, you are a liberal feminist. And if you are not, you are barred from being a part of the conversation. Fulton Sheen put it in these terms, quote, the history of civilization could actually be written in terms of the level of its women. If that is true, what does the level of women today say about our present civilization? Feminism is a political ideology, just like the other dominant political ideologies or interest groups that are dominant in discourse today. Just because you are a woman or support women or love women, equality, or even equity, that does not mean that you are, of course, de facto a feminist. I'll never forget a conversation at the bar of Founding Fathers one afternoon in 2016. I struck up a conversation with an African-American woman at the bar. We talked about the elephant in every room that year, the election. She said she was voting for Hillary Clinton because she was a woman, because she was a feminist. Now, isn't that just the kind of uninformed voting that the anti-suffragettes were concerned about 100 years ago? Feminism is a dated political ideology that has morphed from the right to vote and access higher education and the workforce to a political movement that is synonymous with reproductive rights. There is no right to reproduction. Equality at the expense of sexual difference, which is a complicated issue itself and should be a part of a greater conversation of liberalism and the philosophical roots of the American founding. So looking back at the history of the suffrage movement, let's all be remembered as ladies, not as feminists. Thanks, that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I love all of your Fulton Sheen quotes. He's one of my favorite.
It's one of the reasons I converted to Catholicism.
Wonderful. Actually, fun fact, Fulton Sheen was the reason that Claire Booth Luce converted to Catholicism as well. She had a brief conversation with him. I'm not sure exactly when, but that caused her conversion to belief in God, which is amazing. So love that.
I believe she had that conversation actually at the church that I can see out my window, and she lived in the apartment building or the hotel right outside my window.
That's such a cool connection. Wow.
Yeah.
I love that. And I love all of your Alice von Hildebrand references as well.
Thanks. Full disclosure, I was a feminist, I guess, like most people are in college, and I love Simone de Beauvoir, and I read The Second Sex, and I came across this little book in college, and she just took down Simone de Beauvoir and feminism, and it was radical to me when I was 18, 19, so.
Wow. That's a book that's on my reading list, so I'm glad you reminded us of that one. So we do have a few good questions for you, if you'd like to give us a little bit more of your time. Sure. So the first question, our biggest audience here at the center is college-aged women. So what would you say to a young woman who wanted to tackle this issue specifically on her college campus?
College campuses. So in preparation for this talk, I was watching a discussion last night between Christina Hoff Sommers and AEI and Camille Paglia, and this was I think it was 1996. They were terrified of college campuses back then and how anti-free speech it was. So still alive and well. I would say college is a great time to have these discussions. I know it's a weird time, like the climate in college campuses when I was there, I was in, I think the twilight of a civilization, really. I was in a philosophy club. We debated everything. Everything was on the table. There was no ad hominem arguments. And actually, relevant to this discussion, my department was divided into generally 3 groups of people: the cognitive science kids, the feminists, and then, as we call ourselves, the real philosophers. And there was a division there. And so do not let predisposition to ideas and ideologies as you enter college keep yourself out of a conversation about this. I think when I was in college, we had a network of enlightened women group, and that was the first time that I had met and hung out with Republican or conservative women. That was really cool to see that they were out there and they were organizing around books and intellectual ideas or debate. I would say it depends on what do you want to do in college? You can be a leader for free thought and ideas. I think this is the most crucial moment and the most crucial thing that's happening at college campuses today. There is a tyranny of an ideology, and anything you can do to crack open and, rip the veil down and have these conversations with people is really important. And I think schools are the last hope. I mean, most of these people, when they come to DC, they're pretty set. Rarely would you really encounter women who disagree with whatever you believe in. And so college, it's really important. Read books, have discussion groups, go to as many things as you can and have these conversations.
That's a great answer. In terms of books, do you have, in addition to the Hildebrand book, do you have any other suggestions for our young women for where they can get started with this?
I have a stack of books. I was actually panicking before this. I was like, I need to find my books. This is another one by Alice von Hildebrand I read a while ago on Man and Woman, A Divine Intervention. I could probably put an email list together, but there's so much out there. And I think the most important thing for women, no matter what side of feminism you are on, is to read the founding mothers or whatever of feminism. You know, I read Mary Wollstonecraft in college. I read Simone de Beauvoir. I like Simone de Beauvoir. She's a great writer. So I would say it's more beneficial now that I'm conservative and anti-feminist that I went through reading the serious philosophies underlying, you know, these ideas. And honestly, I just started this book. This is an amazing book. I underlined almost every single thing in the preface and first chapter. And if you really want like a hard punch of like what's at stake and what's happening, Camille Paglia, even just read her essays. If you don't want to read a book, Alice von Hildebrand writes essays on this. Camille Paglia writes essays on this. Just start reading essays. Oh, another person that came to mind that I forgot about, and she converted me to being anti-contraception in 2012 or 2011 before I graduated, Elizabeth Anscombe. She was a very serious philosopher, analytic philosopher, and she wrote a bunch of essays on these sorts of issues. And so I would read Anscombe as well. And she was the ideological inspiration for the Love and Fidelity Network at Princeton, which seeks to combat the hookup culture on college campus. Yeah. So college is a great time.
I had several friends in college who started different chapters of the Love and Fidelity Network. It's a good experience in college.
I would say ultimately when you're dealing with really anyone, but especially in college, intellectually prepare yourself, but ask questions. I find that, you know what you believe, the other people think they know what they believe. If you just ask questions, just keep asking questions, you'll eventually, unravel why you think the way you think. And that's really often the most productive kind of conversations, just a bunch of really good questions.
Mm-hmm. Very, very true. Okay, another question that we have that was a good one. I know you touched on it a little bit, the idea of the impact of this kind of movement on men and masculinity. How do you see that in kind of more tangible ways affecting men in the world today, this issue?
So I think being a Catholic woman in DC, I'm 30 now, I know a lot of men, most of my friends are men. I see in young Catholic men, or just men in general, a hesitancy. I see a kind of fear. I see a beta-ness, alpha beta. I think men have been punished for being alpha in any way. They've been demasculinized by feminism. And I didn't even touch on that in my talk. I wanted to kind of keep it positive, but there's a lot of stuff out there on the breakdown of men by feminism. Women think that they can, and they can procreate on their own. They can financially take care of themselves. An insidious form of equality that I see in the dating sphere is splitting checks. I have very strong opinions on that. Unless you've been dating for a very long time or you're much richer than your boyfriend, you should really never split checks. Yeah, so men are definitely huge casualties. I wanted to start a reading group, jokingly, victims of feminism, and have men and women who have been underserved or undercut or, dragged behind the, freight train of feminism, talk about their experiences. But I think men need to also educate themselves and know what they believe. And, that's why I mentioned sexism in this talk, because there is sexism in the workplace. There is misogyny, of course, but the answer isn't to be an aggressive, anti-male voice as a woman. It is to love men. And that's why I have that Fulton Sheen quote. You need to inspire men to greatness. Men need to be inspired to greatness. And a lot of women today are not being virtuous, not being great. We're at the bottom of the barrel in dating and life and inspiration. We need more Beatrices and women to inspire more Dantes and men. I don't know if that answered his question. I'm assuming it was a boy.
No, that was a good question. There were a couple of us who asked that question, actually. It's kind of a compilation of different questions. But
I love the male perspective. I would love men to have like a round table. I know the feminists will probably try to shut it down and picket it, but I would love for men to sit around and I'd moderate, be like, hey guys, so what do you think of feminism? How do you feel? Like, what's it like? have you dated someone who called himself a feminist? I always make the joke that if a man calls himself a feminist, hand me your man card, because that is just not a thing. I would never date a feminist. I'd rather die alone.
But it is very true. A lot of people say that it doesn't, men don't have anything to do with it at all. Or if they do, it's from that patriarchal perspective of, they don't deserve to have a say in it. But it does affect them in direct ways and in kind of the tertiary ways that we don't really realize.
Yeah.
So another kind of pivot question. I know you said that you're anti-feminist, but do you think there's anything about the current feminist movement that they get right? They do have they have various compelling arguments with a lot of different interpretations. Do you think there's anything that you agree with or that you think is on the right track?
Well, my roommate, Alessandra, I think you're going to have to give me an example of arguments from modern feminists. The first thing that comes to mind is I would say that the Me Too movement is a feminist movement. And I think that there absolutely is a problem with, that's why I mentioned sexism in the workplace. Sexual harassment is a thing. And something that I don't think we've been talking about, and I'm not giving anyone any excuse, I'm just trying to put everything on the table and figure it out. I think part of the problem of sexism in the workplace, the Me Too movement, and where feminists do have a bone to pick, as well they should, as all women should, it's not a feminist issue, it's a female issue, is the workplace has been literally only men for the majority of the century. And as women slowly enter, we started out at the bottom. I just watched Working Girl the other day, really good movie. Women started out as secretaries, in servile roles, assistants, this and that. And it's only been in literally my lifetime that women are on par with men. And if you have these old dudes who have been working their entire lives in a male-dominated system, maybe they're not virtuous men. Maybe they're not Fulton Sheen, Dante kind of guys. And maybe they have these vulgar behaviors. Maybe they're just not great guys. We need to realize that that's a possibility, and we need to combat that. And we need to do it in a ladylike fashion. We don't need slut walks. We don't need pussy hats and marches. We need to have a very serious conversation of how we can integrate well women in the workplace and how to deal with old, archaic, or even abusive, entrenched behavior from men in the workplace. That's, in my opinion, that's really the only viable sort of feminist, mission right now, is to expose abuses in the workplace. So that's the one thing that I think feminism, I'm glad that that's happening right now.
We do have an additional great comment. So one of our attendees said that her late boss is Phyllis Schlafly, which is really, really neat. We're glad you're here with us. So she suggested some of her writings and her books on feminism. But I was also wondering your thoughts about the newest, is it Hulu, the newest documentary?
Miss America, Mrs. America.
Her responding to her, or attempting to portray her, but I think in a sense also attempting to portray any sort of, any of this that we're talking about, the old school, traditional feminists.
So I watched a few episodes of it. First of all, as a filmmaker, the cinematography is amazing. Everyone looks really great. It's beautifully done, well shot, everything. Every time I watch things like this that are probably, feminist manifestos, and there's an underlying, agenda. So I watched The Handmaid's Tale and I was like, oh my gosh, I just want to be married and get pregnant and have kids. So it's misfire there, at least for me. And watching this, it made me dislike feminism and feminists even more than I already did. I was literally getting triggered watching these women, but it was also really beautiful to see how stay-at-home moms, they baked cookies and they gathered women and brought them to Washington to show we have voices. Just because we're not on our own, just because we don't work in a professional setting, doesn't mean we don't have political opinions. And I think that itself is a reminder of why we have the right to vote. Just because we are staying at home doesn't mean we're not involved in politics in some way. Anytime any money is spent on the government, anytime anything is taxed, it touches all of us. And so I think it highlighted the dark side of feminism, I guess accurately. I wasn't alive back then, and I'm not super familiar with Betty Friedan and stuff like that. I know that I came across their works in college, but from what I saw, it kind of reaffirmed what I already thought. I hear that they didn't depict Phyllis Schlafly as accurately as they could have. And I did watch videos of her. She was very sweet and very bubbly, and I love the dynamic. I watched an interview between her and her husband, and you didn't really see that in the show. I think it was really like a feminist interpretation of Phyllis Schlafly, which is another problem I have with feminism, feminists trying to own historical female figures who would never have been a feminist. And I don't have the book with me, but I found this like Renaissance woman who feminists are trying to claim, and I found that really offensive. They try to claim Edith Stein, a great saint, Catholic writer, Teresa of Avila, my namesake saint, my conversion saint. And so it's impossible to claim feminism for any historical figure who is not alive in the milieu and in the world of feminism. It's just not fair, and it's just not, it's like a little ink drop of the picture of their life and their thought. That's my long response.
No, that was good. I've only seen small clips of it and little excerpts, so I'm kind of cringing to watch when I think about the idea of watching it, but I do think that I want to watch it so that I can accurately respond to them.
I'm going to recommend 2 movies for y'all to watch if you want to see feminism on screen, and I was not expecting this, especially with the first one. Rosemary's Baby, randomly watched that over the pandemic, and The Stepford Wives, both written by the same guy. Very interesting depiction of almost like not a cliche, but like the sort of zeitgeist of the time of women getting all these, the sexual revolution, all these rights. And The Stepford Wives, really awesome movie, the one from the 70s. I highly recommend watching that. And actually made me kind of sad, and it made me realize maybe the male perspective of all this, because of course you should never, spoiler alert, kill your wife and trade her in for a robot version of her. That's totally psycho. But it was interesting to see, like, these men, what they really wanted was their wife to dress beautifully and to cook for them and to just be a lady, which is part of the point of my talk. And it was interesting to see that that was a big theme there. And the sort of feminist characters, smoking cigarettes, complaining about their husband. It's like, oh my gosh, come on, you have this beautiful house, you're beautiful, yeah, you got some problems, just chill. Everyone be chill. You don't need a robot, hot, perfect housewife, and you don't need to complain about your husband's chain smoking all day. There's a middle ground.
Very true. Yeah, there's a sense of normal that can be found in the middle here. I think that's the point. So other than, I'm Catholic as well, so I appreciate all of your wonderful Catholic examples. St. Edith Stein is a lovely example. Other than religious leaders, are there any current political leaders or any just powerhouse women today that you admire and would recommend for our young ladies to look up to as role model?
So I don't know if these women are actually even conservative. I have cobbled together women in the public square who basically have my dream life, and they're probably not conservative, but I love Nigella Lawson. She's a TV chef. She loved her husband. She had her babies. She cooks at home. She's created her big career now, and she inspired me to cook and want to be a domestic goddess. I look up to her. I look up to Mimi Thoresen. Again, don't know her political views. She probably calls herself a feminist. Both of them probably do. But Mimi Thoresen is this beautiful French, Asian, or Hong Kong French housewife with her 7 kids, her hot husband, and they live in a chateau in Medoc, France.
Oh my gosh.
Living my dream life, except maybe I'd rather be in Italy than France because I'll never learn French. Those are 2 women that I look up to because they have created a career around their talents, which are actually essentially feminine, homemaking, beauty, cooking, stuff like that, serving their family and their children. So those are just, for some reason, the first 2 people that came to mind. I don't really have politicians I look up to. I'm not a very political person, even though I'm in DC and I work at the Federalist Society.
was interesting.
I'm just a filmmaker. But yeah, those are the first two women in the public square that I look up to, mostly on Instagram.
Yeah, I'll have to, when you were describing Mimi, the second one, I instantly thought that sounds like a great Instagram life.
She's aesthetically integrated in every way.
Yes. All right. Well, those are all of, I think that's kind of a positive note for us to, I think, close on. Thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything else you'd like to say to end our like a final message for our...
I guess, yeah. So I noticed Cara Bell said, how should young conservative women who don't identify with feminism identify themselves? Is it fair to say feminist, or is it better to use feminine lady? So I didn't get into this because I didn't want to get too Catholic, but basically I think Catholicism or even Christianity and feminism are incompatible fundamentally, and that could be another talk. But I don't think conservatives should call themselves feminists. And something that I didn't mention in my talk is I notice all these different feminists like Christina Hoff Sommers and maybe Camille Paglia try to appropriate and mold feminism to fit what they think feminism essentially is or should be. Feminism is a political movement. And if you just look up what feminism is and is doing, you will realize that as a conservative woman, you are not welcome, you are not a part of it. So instead of trying to carve up feminism and cobble together and be like, I'm a feminist too, pay attention to me, I'm a conservative. No, rise above that feminist political ideology and just say, I'm not a feminist, I'm just a conservative woman, I'm just a lady, I'm a feminine conservative, I'm orthodox, like anything, any way you, or just say, don't box me in, I'm not an ist, like I'm Catholic or whatever. You know, you don't have to pick some sort of ideology that suits your whatever, you know. Don't even use the language, don't use labels. As Kierkegaard once said, once you label me, you negate me. So just you don't even need to use those words.
That's a good point. And anytime I think you say I'm a feminist, no matter what your I guess political leanings are, you immediately have to qualify it and say this is in this way or this way. So I do think it is a little bit easier, well, not easier, but just more true to yourself to lead with specific ideas that you believe in or traditions that you kind of ascribe to, instead of leading with a label. And then if you want to add the label at the end, you can, but yeah, that's kind of...
I'm a pursuer of goodness, truth, and beauty.
Yes.
Is that feminist? I don't know.
It should, I think it is, even if you don't realize that it is.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time with us today. It would be great if you could compile that list of books. I know you said you had a big pile. And I wrote down the movies, but if you wanted to include the movies that you mentioned in there as well,
sure.
And I'll forward that to all of our attendees and send it to our followers here at CBL.
Sounds great.
It was lovely talking with you and getting to meet you. I hope we'll get to meet in person at some time.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
Thanks, ladies. Bye.
Have a good day.